So hello, everyone. Welcome to Freedom School. So nice to see you all here. So our topic tonight is the recent leaking of the Supreme Court opinion and imminent Supreme Court decision. My name is Donna Murch, and I teach in the history department. I'm also chapter president of New Brunswick, and I will be hosting tonight along with the wonderful Ian Gavigan, who I will be introducing. So first, I just want to say a welcome to Freedom School. Freedom School was started in the summer of 2020, and the idea was to do organizing during the pandemic when we didn't have in-person meetings available to us and in-person door knocking. And it's really a space for organizing together, for solidarity, for political education, and for ways for us to connect our union and scholarly community to the larger communities that we inhabit and the people that we are. We chose to have an emergency meeting to open up a space to start thinking through the moment we are in, as Roe v. Wade is on the verge of being overturned after decades of chipping away piece by piece at the legal standard. The idea for this Freedom School was born on Monday night when I, like many of you, was experiencing horrific panic upon hearing about the leaking of the opinion. And I read some of Timothy Stewart-Winter, one of our speakers today, some of his tweets, and they were so informative and so constructive that it really opened up to me new ways to think and to talk about this. And also it was Ian Gavigan who sounded the alarm, sent out an email immediately to the Executive Council so that we all were experiencing it in real time. I would say that for me, Monday night was one of those definitive moments that I've experienced politically. There are others that I would liken to the sense that this is a development that will have long-term repercussions. So it is a question both of the immediate effects of this imminent Supreme Court decision, but also the things that will follow and what it means in terms of the state of the country and really the organizing of the right. So I would place for myself this moment within a series of other moments in my adult life from 1991 with the declaration of the first Gulf War, of 2003, the Iraq War, the election of Donald Trump, and the Supreme Court decision. For me, in my lived experience, there were moments where I recognized that this was a definitive moment that would have long-term repercussions. So this will not be the only time that we talk about it, but this is really to start that discussion and create political community and to think about how we organize about it, around it. This Freedom School has defined the dangers we are facing broadly with the far right majority on the Supreme Court, including the imminent threat to reproductive rights, as well as to voting, labor, and environmental rights, and many other gains and rights that have been fought for and won. Some of the core questions before us are, how did we get here? What's next? What social formation is necessary to establish a new, fuller reproductive justice standard in the United States? And what role does our union specifically and the Rutgers community more broadly have in this process? It's at this point I'd like to introduce my co-host, Ian Gavigan, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of History, who is working on a wonderful dissertation on socialism in the state in the Delaware Valley, specifically Reading, Pennsylvania. We also know him as the Union Whisperer, because Ian has been such a force inside the union. Many of the campaigns that have been launched by the union have first been raised and thought of analytically by Ian. He has been core to so many of our campaigns. He is also an organizer with Higher Education Labor United. Ian?
Thanks, Donna, for that too kind introduction. Thank you all for coming on for this emergency call organized on very short notice. So it's a good sign that so many people are ready to come together around this so quickly. And we're really fortunate to have a really great roster of scholars and organizers to speak tonight about this incredibly important topic. We have legal experts, undergrad organizers, statewide campaigners all on the call. We're going to hear about what the Roe decision means concretely in terms of its legal ramifications, in terms of our communities. And we're also going to hear from people about what it's going to take to build a new social formation needed to win. And hopefully we're going to start thinking through that together as well. Next, we're going to hear from a few of our speakers, and around 7:45 or 7:50, we'll try to transition to more of an open conversation format with questions from Donna and myself, and collecting questions from the group. So throughout the conversation, if you do, if questions come to mind, please make note of that in the chats. You can put yourself on stack by just putting the word stack in there. And when we get to the point where our speakers have wrapped up, we're going to kind of come back to the questions and conversation. So without further ado, I want to introduce our speakers. But I think I'll hand it over to Donna, who's going to introduce our opener. So Donna, go ahead.
Thank you. And I also would like to just say a huge thank you to all of our speakers. We're so lucky to have the roster of people that we do and to learn from them and be in dialogue with them. Our first speaker is Professor Alexis Karteron. She is the director of the Rutgers Constitutional Rights Clinic. Prior to joining Rutgers in 2016, Professor Karteron was a senior attorney at the New York Civil Liberties Union. At the NYCLU, she litigated complex constitutional cases involving police reform, the school to prison pipeline, the First Amendment, and voting rights. While at the NCLU, Karteron served as the lead counsel in one of 3 cases challenging the NYPD's stop and frisk practices. Prior to joining the NYCLU, Karteron served as White House Associate Staff Secretary from 2009 to 2010. From 2007 to 2009, she was an assistant counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, where she litigated voting rights cases in the federal courts, including the Supreme Court. Professor Karteron.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Donna, thanks for inviting me and the rest of the union leadership, both for the invite and for hosting this event. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about an event that has really rocked the legal world in so many ways. Obviously, it's rocking all of our world, and that's why we have a great turnout on a Monday evening when I'm sure we'd probably like to be thinking about things besides the Supreme Court of the United States and the trouble that they're causing. And so I guess I'll start by just telling you briefly why the opinion has rocked the legal world, both for what it says and how it has come to pass, and talk a little bit about some potential implications for other rights besides abortion. So first, it's worth just mentioning that this leaked opinion is just something that does not happen. There certainly have been leaks at the Supreme Court before. Most often, though, if there are leaks, it's about the outcome of a particular case or maybe what the vote count is, but it's really unheard of. And there might be other people who are speaking tonight who have spent more time tracking this down than I have. But from everything I've been seeing, this is the first time that an opinion has been leaked so widely and so publicly. And so that's, just shocking some people. And there are some people who are more concerned about the leak than the content. I'm not one of them. I'm much, much more concerned about the content, and I imagine you all are as well. So first, let me start by talking about what Dobbs, the case that the opinion was leaked in, is about. And then I'll talk a little bit about how it compares to the Supreme Court's past cases on abortion care. So first, Dobbs is about a Mississippi law that bans virtually all abortions after 15 weeks. The Mississippi legislature passed this law in an open challenge to Roe against Wade. They knew when they passed this law that it could not possibly survive legal scrutiny under prevailing precedents like Roe versus Wade and Casey versus Planned Parenthood of Southeastern Pennsylvania, which the court decided in 1992. Because the rule that emerged from those cases was that states could not impose outright bans on quote unquote pre-viability abortions. So a state was not allowed, or is still not allowed, I should say, because this is just a draft opinion, not official yet. States are not allowed to ban abortions outright at any point before a fetus would be viable on its own outside of a pregnant person's body. But Mississippi, despite being very clear about this, they went ahead and passed this really devastating law. And it's noteworthy that the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, the most conservative circuit in the United States, regularly issuing wacky opinions that people think are, often fairly close to lawless. Even they said it was clear that this law could not stand because it so openly flouted Roe and Casey. So Justice Alito in this draft opinion says the court has been called upon to reconsider Roe and Casey, and it must reject Roe and Casey. It's worth pausing to note that this is really extraordinary in and of itself. The court did not have to take this case. It did not have to confront this question. It could have let the Fifth Circuit ruling stand, but it chose not to. It reached out and decided to take this case. It reached out and decided that it just had to confront this question of whether Roe and Casey should stand and were correctly decided. So there's a lot to say about the reasoning in the opinion, the inaccuracies, the jurisprudential method that Justice Alito uses, just frankly, the meanness of the opinion. But I want to put all that aside and just talk about what the impact is. So first of all, it seems like there's just no question that Mississippi's law will be upheld. Some of you may have heard rumors that Chief Justice Roberts is trying to draft an alternative opinion, maybe a more moderate opinion that doesn't explicitly overturn Roe as this one does. But I want to be very clear that even if Chief Justice Roberts is successful in drafting an alternative opinion and he gets someone who apparently initially agreed to be in the majority with Justice Alito, that would still be a huge change in law, because Chief Justice Roberts was very clear at the oral argument in Dobbs in December that he basically thought this law was just fine. So even if Roe is not explicitly overturned, we're still in a place of extraordinary threat to abortion care and abortion rights in the United States. So if this opinion stands, there are a number of states that have passed quote unquote trigger laws, meaning that those laws will take effect if the Supreme Court announces that it is overturning Roe. So there are a number of states where the legislatures have gotten ahead of this, they've passed a law, and they don't take effect unless Roe is overturned. And so those will basically instantly go into effect if Roe is overturned by the Supreme Court. And even in the states that haven't passed trigger laws, it seems very likely that they'll move to quickly and severely limit abortion, either by abortion rights, by either shortening the time period in which abortion care can be sought, or imposing restrictions that the Supreme Court has previously struck down. So for example, in Casey, actually, the Supreme Court considered whether Pennsylvania could impose a spousal consent requirement before a person could get an abortion. That kind of thing seems like it is likely to resurface. It also means the federal government would be free to consider a federal ban on abortions. And that doesn't necessarily seem like it would come to pass quickly, but the fact that it could happen if this opinion stands is something that I frankly find terrifying. So if this opinion stands, abortion rights will vary state by state. So part of what Justice Alito talks about is the idea that with Roe, the Supreme Court removed this question from the states, moved the role of abortion regulation from the states, and made it a constitutional issue, and effectively created a constitutional limit on the ability of states to pass bans. So again, it will return to the states and they will be free to do whatever they want. We've already seen abortion access almost entirely eliminated in Texas through SB 8, which I imagine a lot of you have heard about. And so we'll see that quite a bit. The other thing that's been under discussion quite a bit since this draft came out is what this means for other rights. And this has been, I think it's fair to say, pretty contested There are some people who say, you know, this is just about abortion. It doesn't mean anything worrisome for any other right that the Supreme Court has recognized. And to be frank, I'm personally very skeptical that there's nothing to worry about. I actually am quite worried about a number of other rights. So I thought I'd just share briefly what the background to that is. So abortion rights have been recognized under the Substantive Due Process Clause, and those protections attach to certain liberty interests. And abortion is one of them. Others are marriage, private sexual behavior, the right to not be sterilized, access to birth control. So the Supreme Court has held, for example, that states violate substantive due process when they ban interracial marriage, or they ban same-sex marriage, or when they criminalize sodomy. And Justice Alito went out of his way in this draft to say that none of those rights were implicated by this decision because abortion is different. And I think, to be frank, that's pretty laughable. If the right to abortion falls and an opinion that looks close to this one does actually end up being issued by the court, all those other rights will be standing on a very slim reed. And again, those rights will vary state by state. So just like before Obergefell was decided in 2015, there were different states had different approaches to same-sex marriage. Some banned it, some permitted it. We would return to that. And then again, we'd also have the possibility of the federal government passing laws in those areas. You know, some people are very skeptical that the court would, you know, go back on those precedents and reconsider them. But this opinion is really, it's very striking in that it seems to not care one whit about history. It doesn't seem to care one whit about the reliance that women have placed on the idea that access to abortion care is a core right in this country. And so as a constitutional scholar and litigator and teacher, it is really, frankly, fairly terrifying. I wish I had some good news to offer. The only good news I see is that people seem like they're paying attention, like all of you who are here tonight. So I will leave it there. And thank you again for the opportunity to share these thoughts.
Thank you, Professor, for that detailed and powerful statement. We appreciate hearing your expertise, and we look forward to maybe getting some more questions and conversations after some of our next speakers. I want to invite Daria Roithmayr to get highlighted so that she can offer some remarks as well. Daria is a law professor at the University of Southern California who teaches constitutional law to both law students and undergraduates. Her recent book, Reproducing Racism, How Everyday Choices Lock In White Advantage, explores the self-reinforcing dynamics of persistent racial inequality. Her work is heavily interdisciplinary, drawing from economics, sociology, political theory, history, and complex systems theory. She is currently at work on a new book, Racism Pays, which explores the way that recent innovations in the digital economy have relied on racial exploitation to get off the ground. Daria, thank you so much for joining us from California, and we look forward to hearing your perspective on what's going on and what's next for us and our movements.
Thanks so much. I was so thrilled to get Donna's invitation, and thrilled in part because this audience is the kind of audience that I think has much to say with regard to the way forward, given the experience that you all have in political mobilizing. So I want to say four things in follow-up to Alexis. First, to emphasize that this draft opinion is just Justice Alito's opinion. It hasn't benefited from the input of others, and there are some who have argued that the leak was meant to freeze as much of Alito's opinion as possible, because people would see comparing this opinion to whatever comes out as a movement away from Alito's commitments, which isn't to say that we should hope all that much, but just to distinguish that. Second, I want to remark on the way that the draft opinion evinces a real disdain that Alito has for women. So, for example, one of the most remarkable parts of the draft opinion has to do with the argument that even if Roe were wrongly decided, that women have built their lives in reliance on this opinion. And so there are many conservative commentators who take the position that whatever the rightness or wrongness of the original opinion, it must be retained because people have relied on the opinion. And Alito takes this on by saying that the ability of women to participate in economic and social life is just a generalization about the national psyche. This notwithstanding the fact that he makes such generalizations himself, for example, remarking on the dismantling of monuments as divisive and troubling to those who would have to witness it. He also says, even more troublingly, that these interests in participation in social and economic life, the way in which women's position in the workforce is very much supported by the right to abortion, those interests are not as important as the economic or property interests that derive from contract. Those are the interests that he would count. These are not such important interests. And so for me, that really frames the, in many ways, emotional scaffolding on which this opinion is based. It makes sense then that he overturns Roe, given the disdain with which he treats women's interests, if not women's rights. The third thing I want to talk about is to disagree a little bit with Alexis with regard to the future of other rights. I'll say straight out that Alito's reassurance and a dime will get you a cup of coffee, maybe. But to emphasize that there are distinctions that Alito's opinion tries to make between abortion on the one hand and contraception, structuring the family, refusing unwanted medical treatment, the right to marry. These are all cases on which Roe and Casey were based. And Alito's draft says explicitly that those rights are different from abortion. Now, the distinction that he offers is one that is strange to legal scholars like myself, who are used to thinking about rights as separate from the state interests that the states assert in order to regulate the rights. And Alito says abortion is different from all of these other rights, like the right to contraception, because it involves the destruction of fetal cells. And he says that as a result, because abortion is different, that this decision to overturn Roe will not undercut contraception, family decision-making, or the other rights. He's not so clear about same-sex marriage and same-sex sexual privacy, but the way in which he cites to those cases is at least worth remarking on. For example, he cites to the cases involving same-sex sexual privacy, in particular Lawrence versus Texas, with a parenthetical that I might have written myself if I wanted to frame that right as robustly as possible. He calls it the right to engage in consensual sexual activity, meaning he buys into the idea that this is a general right to sexual privacy, as opposed to a specific right to same-sex sexual privacy, which under the rest of the opinion might not have the kind of deeply rooted history and tradition that would give the right its constitutional foundation. Having said that, I agree with Alexis that this is not a court in which I invest a lot of trust into. And once Roe as a domino falls, other dominoes might fall, with other justices writing the majority opinions. The last thing I'll say is perhaps the most important, and that is the importance of mobilizing at the level of not just political organizing, but mass movement, demand organizing. 65% of Americans support Roe with some restrictions. There are incredible opportunities to mobilize at the political level. I'm not sure what's going to happen with the Protection of Women's Health Act, because the votes to end the filibuster and the votes in particular to push that legislation through don't seem to be there. At the same time, I think pressure at the level of not just Congress, but taking to the streets is something that obviously is, in my view, the path forward. And in many ways, as devastating as this decision is, this might be the opportunity to, for once and for all, get federal legislation that protects women's rights to choose. And that, I think, is the beacon of hope, even if it's not particularly realistic hope at the moment, in which we can invest our energy. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Roithmayr. Our next speaker is Ms. Faustina Owoh. She is president of the Rutgers NAACP. She is double majoring in political science and women and gender studies with a minor in international and global studies. She is also a participant in the Leadership Scholars Certificate Program here at Rutgers Institute of Women's Leadership. We're excited to hear her analysis. Ms. Owoh.
Yes, thank you so much. So my last name is Owoh. It's okay. Everybody always gets it like wrong. It's fine. It's Owoh. My name is Faustina Owoh. Thank you so much for having me here. We actually, for an NAACP, we actually just had our reproductive justice rally like 3 hours ago. And so I felt like it was very important to do that. Especially, so when I first heard about the draft decision, a part of me kind of froze. It was almost as if like I was shocked, but at the same time not, because the Roe versus Wade decision has been something that I feel like has been on target ever since the decision was made. And so there's this constant conversation, these constant conversation is literally just about, okay, so what's going to happen to this decision as we move on? And this has been an ongoing conversation for years. A lot of my classes, this is one of the main topics we talk about in every class I've taken, Roe versus Wade. Like, where do you think this is going to go in the future, right? What are politicians saying about this? And so I think the fact that we're literally seeing this unfold in front of our eyes is alarming, especially for me as a young Black woman, because I've seen so many stories of Black women how these abortions, how it affects them, and how honestly this weaponization of women's bodies, for our bodies, is always going to be politicized. And I think the first thing I thought of was, if Roe versus Wade gets overturned, the first group of people I thought that were in my mind was, how are Black women, how are people of color, what are their experiences going to be like, right? Because a lot of people of color, they don't have access to research, they don't have access to certain environments, they don't have access to a lot of these other opportunities that like other groups have. And so I just kept on thinking, like, what's going to happen, right? So, or even people who have to take contraceptives, right? I just saw something earlier today about a lot of how different states are starting to ban certain types of contraceptives. And that just makes me think like, I know someone I'm very close to, she's on birth control because she has horrible cramps, and to the point where she can't stand. And so I'm thinking about all these personal stories of people that I know, and how this is just going to affect us, and how this is going to really affect everyone. To people who claim that it's a woman's issue, it's not. It's everybody's issue. Everybody will get affected somehow, some way, shape, or form, whether it's the people that you love, or people that you know, or people that you come in communication with. And it kind of makes me very emotional, very sad, but it also gives me hope to continue fighting, I think. And that's the energy that I got at the rally that my organization had earlier today. We had so many different people come out and speak. And a lot of the people that were speaking, and also a lot of people speaking, were cisgendered men. And that really made me very happy, because I do think they also need to be part of the conversation. They also need to be a part of the people who are fighting for these rights. And so I'm constantly reminded that as youth, as people who are, trying to take up these spaces of advocacy and activism, I think it's so important for us to continue to take up these spaces. It's very important for us to have formats like this where people can just come and talk, right? Come and talk, ask questions. What are your concerns? How do you think we could better help with these issues and stuff like that? And so I definitely think that this decision is definitely gonna change. It's going to change a lot of things, but also going to change how I feel like people choose to be activists. I definitely think it's going to bring more people out, even though I already had. I definitely think people are going to go, okay, no, this is actually an issue. This is something that I think we all need to be a part of. And so I'm hoping that that's the case. And I'm definitely for me, I'm definitely making sure I use my voice in every way possible I can. So I'm so happy I was able to come on here and be one of the speakers because it's important. I think that's when I come and emphasize it at the rally today, was just to use our voices. And I know sometimes it can be intimidating, especially if you feel like, maybe maybe this doesn't affect you directly. So you kind of feel, uncomfortable about speaking on certain things. But I feel like it affects humans, it affects people. And so therefore it's important for all of us to use our voices. Thank you.
Thank you, Faustina. It's really powerful and incredible to hear what you through the Rutgers NAACP and your colleagues are doing together. I think we're inspired by that work, and as the union of graduate students and full-time faculty, librarians, and postdocs, I think we want to work together because we need a united front. So thank you. Next, I'm going to invite Timothy Stewart-Winter to speak about some of the implications that this draft decision can and likely will have. Timothy Stewart-Winter is Associate Professor of History who teaches in American Studies and Women and Gender Studies. Stewart-Winter's work has appeared in the Journal of American History, the Journal of Urban History, Gender and History, and the Journal of the History of Sexuality. He writes regularly about LGBTQ politics and history for a wider audience, including op-eds in the in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Star Ledger of New Jersey, Dissent, and Slate. And he's the author of Queer Clout, Chicago and the Rise of Gay Politics. Tim, could you tell us more about the kind of the larger consequences, stakes around gay marriage, sodomy laws, trans rights, politics at the state level, and the path forward?
Absolutely. I'm actually going to focus on the latter of those, the sort of political implications, rather than the significance for sodomy and gay marriage, in part because I actually know less about that than the two speakers who've already spoken, who are law professors. But I'm a political historian, and the first thing I want to say is most Americans really don't pay much attention to the Supreme Court, but this could be a moment when that's changing. Partly, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who died just before the 2020 election, and Amy Coney Barrett, who Republicans rushed to confirm as her replacement, are both better known than most Supreme Court justices. And abortion access may really end in half this country next month. Now, it's important to note that Congress in 1976, 3 years after Roe, effectively gutted it for many poor women in this country by saying federal funds can't be spent on abortion. Still, most Americans have lived in a country where for 50 years in all 50 states, there is a norm that the freedom to be a parent is a choice and not a chance. And that may be about to change. Certainly the unprecedented Texas law that went into effect last fall has already brought about an unprecedented change in that sense by closing, a huge state's abortion clinics. So we're looking at wide-scale forced childbirth in dozens of states, and people notice when something is taken away. Obamacare became much more popular when it was threatened by Republicans in Congress, for example. So the second point I want to make is the country is not actually divided about abortion. Most Americans don't feel especially strongly about abortion, and they don't vote based on that issue. There's a small chunk of the electorate on either side who feel strongly. And I want to acknowledge a pollster named Tressa Undum, who specializes in this area and had a great Twitter thread about this this week, about why sort of the Gallup tracking poll, which side are you on, doesn't really capture the reality of how Americans feel about this issue. People are surprisingly poorly informed about abortion. They don't know what the laws are in their state. They don't know who gets abortions, how often, or why. Abortion is not like same-sex marriage, in part because people don't talk about their abortions. It is stigmatized, and it less so perhaps than in a very long time, or maybe ever before, but it remains something that people don't discuss very often, their own experiences with abortion. A point that Tressa Undum makes on Twitter that's important is we tend to think of the public as divided between pro-life and pro-choice, but 4 in 10 Americans say they are neither or both. She also notes Americans don't struggle with this issue. 2/3 say it is not for them personally a religious issue. And many voters believe both that abortion is killing a potential or actual life, but also that women should be able to make their decisions about it. Most Americans say both that they respect religions that don't believe in abortion, and also that they respect that women have a choice to get an abortion. What voters don't like, and this is sort of my hunch, I suspect that we're going to see a revulsion, at least on the part of some of those voters in the middle, at the notion of the government, and this is state legislatures that will be doing this, right? Not, at least immediately, not Congress, not the federal government, but state legislatures in half the states dictating what options people have about abortion. People are wary of the right-wing takeover of the federal courts, but there's a whole history to that, and it is more extreme than people realize. Trump is the first justice since Nixon who got to choose 3 Supreme Court justices. And when Nixon was president, this may be hard to believe, but abortion was not an issue that the 2 parties had split on. Amy Coney Barrett was the first justice in 150 years to be confirmed with 0 votes from the Senate's minority party. And so this is really a culmination of a 40-year quest to take over the courts. In Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Pennsylvania, Democratic governors on the 2022 ballot will be the last line of defense against extremist Republican-controlled state legislatures. And there are a lot of people who don't want Roe wiped out, who are likely to be either marginal Democratic midterm voters, because Democrats do not vote in midterm elections anywhere near as consistently as Republicans, or who are independent and Republican women. Strong religious opponents of abortion are passionate, but they're not a majority in many states, maybe no states. And in every swing Senate race and every purple state, criminalizing abortion with no rape or incest exception is extremely unpopular. And I'll stop there. Went a little bit over, but thank you so much. I'm so grateful to the union for organizing this, and to Donna for organizing this.
Thank you so much, Professor Stewart-Winter. Thank you for giving us some hope at the end there for strategies that we might use to think about how we can get people to mobilize against this.
A titan of the labor progressive movement in New Jersey. She worked for 4 decades with the CWA, I think 14 of those as the NJ state director. Am I getting those numbers right? And she's been a top advisor to the Murphy administration and campaign, and she's been taking a leading role in formulating the statewide progressive response and strategy around Roe and abortion rights in the past week or so. So we are very lucky to have Hetty with us, and just looking for some wisdom from you, some thoughts from you about how we, as organized workers in coalition with other progressive forces, can move the ball forward.
Thank you so much. And thanks very much for having me here at Freedom School. The last time I was at Freedom School, I was 7 years old. and we were boycotting the Brooklyn schools because they were segregated. So first of all, I agree with everything that Lori said. I think this is fascism, and I want to say that people need to prepare themselves for some further blows, not just in terms of Roe, but in terms of other decisions that are going to be made in the next 6 weeks. The court is going to rule on whether or not all race-conscious admissions policies are illegal. There's going to be an affirmative action decision. There's going to be a decision that has to do with whether or not states can prevent the use of federal money in private religious schools. And finally, and this is the most terrifying of all, the court is potentially going to be deciding whether or not there can be a requirement for permits for concealed weapons. The court could decide that you have to have permitless concealed weapons. So to me, this is the ultimate of the issue of fascism and violence, and the fact that what we are facing potentially is a very violent situation, because there are millions and millions of guns in the hands of very right-wing extremists. And so I can't say more strenuously that I think we are facing fascism. I think we're in the midst of, the most dangerous point in my life as an activist and somebody who's been engaged in political life. So I want to now come to the question of what the hell do we do, and what is our responsibility now, and what do we want to do? So first of all, I think we should recognize that you are actually, I think, in the most important positions that there are to protect democracy and to give it safe space. And I think that is our universities. We may very well lose democracy. I think it's even likely. And I think it is likely we will lose Roe. I think it is likely we will enter a more dangerous period. But the fact of the matter is, it is universities that have been the incubators and the safe space for the most important social changes that have taken place in our country, right? Whether or not it's where the freedom riders were recruited, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and CORE and SDS and the Women's Liberation Movement, the anti-war movement, obviously, the Black Panther and the Black Power movement, deep roots in our universities, as well as any number of gay rights, any number of other examples. And in fact, without question, yes, universities and labor, no question about it. But in particular, the women's liberation movement that I became a part of at age 14, when the key issues were the right to be able to get contraception and abortion. And momentarily, by the way, within the next few weeks, HBO will be putting out the story of Heather Booth. I don't know how many people know Heather Booth, somebody very dear to me, who between 1968 and 1973 organized with other women at the University of Chicago, the Janes, where 11,000 young women were able to get abortions, safe abortions through illegal abortions through medical providers. Yes, well, I just actually talked to her about doing something else. And when people say, what should we do? I think these are the things we should do. I think that in addition to the fact that we're going to hit the streets, we're going to have to do huge midterm work. I don't know how else to put this. Lead, follow, or fund. You don't get to just talk about it. You have to participate. We have to participate as union members. We need students to participate, and we need to be in the streets and deeply engaged in these midterm elections here in New Jersey, where frankly, we could lose 3 seats, 3. And we are, we have 5 seats here that we are playing with. We could lose 3 of them here in this state. So lead, follow, or fund, actually participate, actually work on campaigns, get students to work on campaigns, actually come out. And if you can't, and go to other states as well. And if you can't, then send money. I say that just very simply. That has to happen in terms of everyone. But the other piece of this is there are some things we could do. We could create the Janes right at Rutgers University with students, with faculty, with other groups, where we are making it clear that anyone in a state where there is, that loses abortion rights can come here, and we will find a way to pay for it. We will find a way to house people, and we will make sure that they are safe. Because if we do not have movements like that, we won't overcome this. I really do think that. I think we need movements at that level, and we could do that. We could do it right in this university as well as other universities. Then there's very basic, simple things like in the town of Hamilton, there's Samuel Alito Way, where I want to converge upon the town of Hamilton and insist that it turns into Women's Rights Boulevard or Ruth Bader Ginsburg Avenue. So those are really basic things. But bottom line is that I think we have to be talking about real serious activity, bodies, people in the street, and action, and moving students to action, and making the university, our university, our state university, a core place for activism. So there is constant, yes, modern day Janes can help women get abortion pills, but and get abortions. And, but I actually feel like we need action every week, all the time at university campuses, whether or not it's every Thursday and it's this many people, whether it's teach-ins as there was in the anti-war movement, every week, constantly, every class that you can. And the fact that we are union members becomes a key and critical part. We have some job security. We have tremendous authority, and it now is our time. So there's lots of things that are going on as well. Yes, draft resistance movement. There's many movements, but I do think it is these movements. And then the other piece is actually being seen as what we are. Going to all these events in our union colors, demanding and insisting that our unions at the national level take a position and not be narrow in terms of economic issues. So I think that's the other critical piece that we have to do as union members. I think that's very quick what I'm thinking of off the top of my head, but we could spend an hour, 2 hours just brainstorming actions between now and November, and making sure every single week on every single campus, there is visibility and action taking place.
Thank you so much, Hetty. Okay, so I want to make sure that we have time for discussion. We have 2 really good questions in the chat. We may have more. I want to get to those questions in the chat. And before I do that, do any of the speakers want to respond to one another? There was some really interesting points of convergence and also tension. So before we open up to the Q&A, would anyone like to respond to one another? Okay, so I'll start with my colleague from the history department, Belinda Davis's question. Belinda, do you want to say yours on camera? Or do you want me just to read it? Okay, well, I'll start by reading it. I was surprised by Timothy Stewart-Winter's characterization of public opinion on choice. I wonder if all the panelists could speak from their different perspectives regarding the most effective forms of action and demands for action, like the mass protests that Faustina Owoh is organizing. Yes, also demands to Congress people to pass laws explicitly guaranteeing the right to choose, guaranteeing the right to choice, although that wouldn't work at least before the midterms. State level demands, what else? What kinds of education, especially in light of Timothy's claims? And I would just fold this into a question that we were going to ask, which is, what specific forms of organizing, movement building, or social formation are necessary right now? What is the horizon, and what are the immediate and medium term goals? And any of the speakers are welcome to respond.
Looks like Hetty's has her hand up.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here, and with the hope that I don't upset anybody. But look, I do think we are facing fascism. And when you are facing fascism, you have to create a united front against fascism. And that's what happened in the 30s. People were really clear about it, that there had to be a united front against fascism. And that's why you ended up with things like the Communist Party supporting FDR. I think that we are sometimes a little bit off here. When we are facing something as serious as this, we need laser sharp politics that are about protecting democracy and actually not worrying about other things, even things that have been very important to us in the past. And so if we're facing attacks on racial justice, attacks on voting rights, attacks on women's rights, really facing danger from gun violence, those things, that is not the time to focus on what at the end of the day end up being minor differences. In fact, maybe it's not even the time to focus on major differences. We need a united front that may go from Elizabeth Warren to Liz Cheney, right?
Thanks, Hetty.
So I just want to say that is the political formation. It is a united front against fascism, and it isn't all of the political differences we might have had otherwise.
Thanks, Hetty. Faustina, and I think I also saw Tim's hand. So Faustina, could you go first?
Sure. I would say, I feel like the most effective form, I really do feel like since I've been a student leader, we've done several protests during my time at Rutgers that kind of were mostly for students. Like literally every protest that I've done or been a part has been organized by students. And so I see that is effective, but I've also noticed the impact that more so Instagram specifically has on certain issues and in terms of how we use our social media platforms. And so I remember when we did a Breonna Taylor vigil, and we had a rally, but we also did a live discussion where we actually had people come in and we actually talked about some of the surrounding talks about what was going on at that time. And I realized, based on the feedback that I got, I realized that people felt more inclined to want to do more through the discussion that we had, like literally a discussion like this. And so I found myself kind of like, that was, I was thinking of that question. I feel like being active in protests or definitely rallies or definitely ones where people can use their voice. But I also know that there's also something about on social media, people being more comfortable using their voices, people feeling like, okay, like a lot of eyes are on me. So I feel like I can be in a space where I can say what I want to say, and I can actively bring on people to come into these spaces. So I that's just from my perspective. So I definitely feel like all formats are important, but I've noticed how important it is through the like social media aspect of it.
Thank you, Faustina. Timothy, did you want to go next?
I would love to just say one thing, really. I think how this plays out first of all, I loved what Hetty Rosenstein just said. I thought that was brilliant. I think how this plays out depends on how accurately people understand what's going on. The fall of Roe will be followed by extreme laws in Republican-controlled states, and Republicans will distance themselves from what they have done, and it's important to fight that. We need to educate people about what is happening in those states. I think it's important to say this is anti-democratic. Overturning Roe has been the lodestar of a right-wing movement since the 80s. 3 of the 5 individuals who will overturn Roe were chosen by Trump, who got fewer votes than his opponent. He won only because of the Electoral College. One of those seats was stolen by Mitch McConnell in a completely unprecedented violation of norms. The Texas abortion law went into effect without the court even hearing the case. This is the so-called shadow docket, which is happening more and more. And I think it's important to say this is extreme and anti-democratic. Missouri may outlaw its own residents going to another state to get an abortion, which this idea that a state law is operative outside its borders, we haven't seen that since the Fugitive Slave Act, which helped start the Civil War. I think we need to really talk to people about the extremism and the anti-democratic nature of what's happening.
Thank you so much, Tim. Did anyone else want to jump in? If not, we have lots of other questions. We have a question here from Luke Spaltro. Thinking of Lori talking about the possibility of fascism, I feel as if we're already there. In the 1970s, the American Indian movement discovered that 43% of Indigenous women had been unknowingly sterilized in their raid of the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs. We still see this continuing with ICE in the current day. My question is, how else have we seen fascistic control on bodily autonomy in history? And how can we use these instances to inform our current forms of organization? And I would especially love to hear from some people that we haven't heard from yet in the question and answer. Thoughts?
I'll just jump in to say really quickly, one of the things that's really interesting about that kind of thing, a question I got from my first year law student, constitutional law students this semester, when I talked about the Supreme Court standards around things like forced sterilization and talked about some of the history involving Black women, involving Indigenous women, involving Latinx women, et cetera, because of course there are these horrific histories in all these communities. My students were kind of, understandably appalled. And they also said, well, how did this happen if the Supreme Court has said you have a fundamental right to control your own body when it comes to reproductive choice for many decades? So even before Roe, the Supreme Court recognized that the government could not sterilize you without a very compelling justification, which it pretty much never has in the modern era. So I think partly just to echo what Hetty said and what everyone else has been saying, kind of spreading the word about the fact that these things have happened in our history. I mean, I was really struck in teaching first year constitutional law this semester at how little this history is known. So I think continuing to spread the word about the fact that this is something that the United States government or parts of the United States government has done for generations is really essential. And it makes me think actually of the controversy around family separation at the southern border. And obviously, so many of us were just completely appalled by what the Trump administration was doing. But I also felt like it was really essential to tie it to a longer history of family separation perpetrated by the United States government. So, I mean, maybe, I guess it's not surprising. We're obviously all fans of education here. So I hope that continuing to talk about these things and inform the public of these things can be a really crucial tool in motivating people to act. I won't further repeat everything that Tim just said, but I think I would just really echo that people need to understand what's happening and that the risks are really real. Because I think when it comes to this opinion, it's been really striking to me since it was released that many of us in the legal field fully expected this. I mean, this was not at all a shock. I mean, the justices on the court, although, you know, none of them said at their confirmation hearings that they would overturn Roe versus Wade, this was absolutely no surprise in any way, shape, or form to at least to legal scholars who've been paying attention, other court watchers who've been paying attention. So I think, you know, just continuing to spread the word is really, really, really important, because I've been a little bit shocked at how shocked people are, because this was just utterly expected, given the radical politics of the people on the court.
Thank you so much, Professor Karteron. Anyone else before we move on to our next question?
I would say, Donna, actually, you could tell us, I think, something about this. If we consider dimensions of mass incarceration, fascistic control of bodily autonomy, I mean, you know, that's something that we've been living with for a long time. We don't tend to think of it in those terms, but maybe, what do you think about that? I don't know.
Oh, well, thank you for asking. You know, it's a really, really important point. Recently, for an event, I just reread Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, and I was reading this section on redemption. And this is a book that I've read multiple times, and each time I've read it, I've read it differently based on what was happening. And I was really struck by Du Bois talking about the overturning of Reconstruction and the violence of redemption. And he talks about the central role played by the police. So he literally talks about the police as the core force of reaction, and he actually uses the word fascism. So to think about that, you know, rewriting the history of fascism, in which we have an alternate genealogy that focuses on this earlier period centered in the United States and other settler colonial countries like it. So I think that would be the first thing. And of course, we know that redemption is followed by this new form of convict leasing, which in total numbers of people killed as a result is much larger numbers than lynching. So I think about, you know, both policing and thinking about the roughly 1 million people in the United States that are part of the carceral state. So that includes all different forms of law enforcement, prison guards, private security, that in many ways, these are the shock troops. These are the shock troops of racial fascism. And this system of mass incarceration, which, you know, with the different forms of civil death, of rights stripping, the physical containment, the fact that simply being incarcerated means that your lives on average are 10 years shorter. And of course, all the horrific neglect and medical care, and even the history of medical experimentation that gave right to human subjects protocols that we all now use. So it's an excellent point, Lori, that it is one of the core incubators of American fascism and racial fascism, with disproportionate targeted incarceration as well. One question I guess I would add to this is that how we talk about both, because it's clear that this is part of the long history of the United States. We are a settler colonial country in which democracy itself was not fully realized until 1965. That's very late in our history. So we are a country that simultaneously extended voting rights first to a property white male voter, and then we have this, you know, expansion of suffrage. But democracy itself is actually quite new in the United States. And unfortunately, when I think about this ruling and the far right Supreme Court, I'm reminded of the tenuousness and the vulnerability of our democracy in that context.
Thanks, Donna. And thank you, everyone. It's incredible to see just how many people are sticking around for almost a full hour and a half. I think that speaks to how important this is. And so I just want to tee up a final question and a half, I guess, before we before we end. And I also just want to flag for everyone that we never mean for our political education to just be educational. We also mean for it to be kind of leading towards action. And so we do want to follow up from this. And I know our president, Becky Gibbons, in the room. We want to follow up on this with getting together as many people who feel committed coming out of this to take some of the lessons we're learning and bring it forward to our union in a more formal form. But I want to just pose a question that I think is related to some of what's been said about electoral politics. I think many in the labor movement, many in the progressive movement have been frustrated by years of democratic posturing on choice and on abortion rights with little national action. And yet for the foreseeable future, the Democratic Party remains the only explicitly electoral formation over which we might imagine having any leverage. How do we operationalize a united front as we're talking about it, that actually gets the job done? That's one thing. And then I think a related question is, as coming from our own positions as academic workers, how do we and what does it look like to build meaningful student, worker, student, faculty, staff action in this process? So that's to our panel. Just give us a quick hand raise if you want to weigh in.
And if I could just add a small addendum to that question, I wanted to thank Hetty Rosenstein for bringing up the question of campuses and how important they have been to organizing over the last 50 years and earlier. So this question about how can we organize, how do we keep this conversation going? And I will say, I agree with Hetty 100% that we need a popular front. We need to build coalitions with people that we don't like. I think one of the challenges is, one, thinking about the relationship between liberals and the left and how they can come together to create coalitions. I'm a big believer in separating out home versus coalition. So you can create coalition with people that you may not like, but that you can find common points of interest. One challenge I see is that thinking about who we're going to include in this coalition, when I think organizing Republican women, for example, who may believe in women's right to choose, say the Liz Cheneys of the world, how to hold together a coalition with that of those people, but also with communities of color in which there's been so much social harm that's been done. So I think a question about how do we think about building coalitions, how do we use the university, and we're of course a state university union, how do we build these coalitions, and how do we do that in the context of the resources of our university?
I just want to jump in and say that was wonderful. Liz Cheney is super anti-abortion, super anti-Roe. She does think Trump lost the election.
It was just the name that worked, Liz to Liz.
Yes, totally.
So look, I think these are really the difficult questions that we have as political people. These are them. And very often we sort of end up in, we so easily split into sectarianism, or that this is the answer, or these people disagree here and there, which is why when we figure out actions, direct action around issues, we don't have to cope with that. We just have to get people there. And we just have to create opportunities for people to participate. So I think that's one part. The second part is, and I think this is deep discussion is needed about this to figure out. I just came off this Murphy campaign. I'd never worked on a campaign in my life, let alone for a Democrat. In a paid staff position, right? I was a Bernie delegate. But I learned a lot. I really learned a lot. And I learned a lot about what we don't do. It just sort of miraculously, how much we don't engage communities of color, how sort of backwards every single campaign is in terms of trying to reach out to people who are frequent voters as opposed to trying to reach out to people who are infrequent voters. So many things of that nature. So when we figure out what we're doing, if we focus on activities instead of how to make everything perfect, if we just focus on, okay, we're going to try to have a demonstration, around this issue, and we know we don't want all white people there, we don't want all kids there, we want a diverse group, we want to reach people in a whole bunch of ways, then we build it around the actions instead of trying to figure out the perfect coalition before we get to the action. So that's just my piece of how to do this.
Thanks, Hetty.
Especially when there's no time.
Thank you, Hetty. And I want to pass it to Faustina, who we have about 2 or 3 minutes left. Maybe if you could give us a last word in response to these big questions.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm kind of dry right now, but I think to answer the question, I'm more so about that that collision between, not collision, but that collab between the faculty and students. I definitely think, specifically here on Rutgers, I feel like one thing I've noticed that the only reason I know about the R1 coalition and the Rutgers AAUP-AFT, because I personally have been I've met professors who have spoken to me personally about it, and this is something I generally have an interest in. I feel like a lot of student orgs still don't know what that entails, right? Especially when it comes to like student orgs that are social justice based. And so I definitely think in terms of, okay, it's like how can we build on with each other? How can we work more with each other? I definitely think is one, collaborating, right? Going to like trying to find a common ground, whether that's going to meetings or like, reach out to certain leadership positions, certain organizations, just to get that like, that collaboration going on. Because like I told my professor that I really do want this to be an issue that more students care about, more students want to work with the union. So I definitely think that's one of the ways, is just constantly being in our spaces, because oftentimes students, it's almost like, it's not that we don't want to, but it's like, how do we do that when there's so many other things that we're trying to accomplish as well? And same thing I can imagine, same thing with faculty members. It's like, there's so many different spaces, so many different things that we're trying to fight against, trying to fight for. But we just don't know how to do it. So I think if we're constantly in each other's spaces, I feel like that could make the collaboration much stronger. So that's what I have to say about that.
Thank you so much. And that's such a powerful message to go out on. Donna, would you like to close us out here?
Sure. First, I just want to give a huge round of Zoom applause to all of our speakers. Thank you so much. This was so informative. I'm already planning on rewatching it. I was trying to take notes, but the information we got about how to understand the decision through a legal frame, placing it in history, all the different kind of multifaceted approaches. I just feel very fortunate to be at Rutgers and among so many wonderful, smart people. This will not be the end of this. Our union is actively thinking about how to organize around these issues. I'm going to put my email in the chat. I think, and Ian, you might speak to this. We're thinking about forming a union committee specifically to work on this. So translating some of our community and political education into concrete organizing, as all of our speakers have called for. I think that in many of the organizing spaces that I inhabit, especially when we're talking about the far right march of the United States and other countries throughout the world, a common phrase that people are using now is inside, outside, and against the state. So this is a way, especially with people who are working on abolition and recognize the long history of US repression and this lived experience of racial fascism, but also in some ways, electoral politics and state politics has become quite urgent because of the nature of how far right the state is moving. And that says a lot given American history. So I'm gonna put my email in chat, and I'll just say that after Freedom School, we'll leave the link up for a few minutes afterwards. In years past for Freedom School, we've had an after party where people still want to talk or chat or grab their favorite beverage. I'll be there.